totally different project. I will bring you to Russia today. To Russia. No, not anymore. But... So I'd like to share a story with you that relates to the topic of cherish and destroy in a different way. A story that's about the construction of a new history in the landscape. The construction of a new history, new identity, new culture. This story personally started for me in 2008, 2014, and definitely in 2022, it was put in a totally new light. But let's start with the beginning. In 2008, I was on a journey through the Baltic states. But what happened? This journey suddenly ended on the Lithuania-Kaliningrad border. At the time, I had never heard of Kaliningrad, but immediately I got fascinated by this closed Russian exclave. Here you see it on the map. You see it's situated on the Baltic Sea, in between Poland and Lithuania, so amidst all EU territory. A few months after the journey, Barack Obama won the US elections of 2008, and within a few hours he got congratulations by the Russian President Medvedev. Remarkable was that Medvedev concluded his congrats with the announcement that he would base Iskander missiles in Kaliningrad in order to counter US plans to build a missile defense shield in Poland. At that moment, I realized that Kaliningrad was not just a Russian exclave amid EU territory, but moreover an object of geopolitical games and war rhetoric. From then on, questions started growing in my head around enclosed areas and geopolitical strategies in the outer border zones of Russia, but also questions about these border zones' multi-interpretable histories, their ideologies and their architectures. All these questions together eventually led to my project Border Theories, a project about the interplay of architecture, ideology and history in 3 urban experiments in the outer border zones of the former Soviet Union. Kaliningrad, it's totally in the west, Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk in the far east, above Japan here on the map, and then Birobidzhan on the Chinese border. All 3 experiments have multi-interpretable histories. Kaliningrad, a Soviet and a Prussian history, Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, a Soviet and a Japanese history, and Birobidzhan, a Soviet and a Jewish history. Birobidzhan was conceived as the first Soviet Jewish city in the world. Border Theories questions the construction of history and identity in the 3 experiments and the way in which architecture and urban planning are employed as political instruments to write, rewrite, and manipulate history in the landscape. It's a very, very big and complex project, so for now I only tell you something about Kaliningrad. But before I go on, I'd like to introduce you to another Soviet Union border area, the Zone. The Zone is an enclosed area in the film Stalker by the Russian filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky, as you might know. The film was shot nearby Tallinn, Estonia, and was released in 1979. In the years after the release, many interpretations of the Zone appeared, and as times changed, so did the interpretations. As such, the Zone has been thought to represent the Soviet gulags, or a site of alien invasion, or the prediction of the Chernobyl disaster, and many, many more. The same way of interpreting the landscape happens in the film itself. I'd like to recall a fragment in which the 3 protagonists, the guide, the author, and the scientist, start exploring the Zone. They question the landscape and put all kinds of interpretations on it. What was it, if not a meteorite? I told you, no one knows. And what do you think? Nothing, or anything. This questioning of the landscape and the searching for all kinds of realities, truths and histories in the landscapes, that's what my work is about. In order to do so, I use all kinds of materials like photography, film, archival material, text. The materials show urban landscapes, but also very empty landscapes, or rather apparently empty landscapes. All landscapes bring many, many questions to me. What am I seeing? What am I looking at? What is truth? What am I supposed to believe? What dreams, plans, and thoughts experiments have been projected onto the landscape? What is the thinking underlying those dreams and plans? How does this all relate to the past, to the present, to the future? Through this ongoing questioning of the landscape, my work sometimes seems a bit an exercise in looking or observing, an exercise in looking again and again, interpreting again and again, always with another or new perspective. But back to Kaliningrad and the construction of history in the landscape. How were architecture and urban planning employed as political tools to rewrite, manipulate, or falsify history in the landscape? These days, Kaliningrad is quite a lot in the news due to its situation as this Russian exclave amidst EU territory. But for those who are not so familiar with it, I'll tell you a bit about its history. Kaliningrad used to be the city of Königsberg. Königsberg was founded in 1255 and became the capital of the so-called State of the Teutonic Order. Later, it became the capital of the Duchy of Prussia, and still later, the capital of East Prussia, a province of the Kingdom of Prussia. From 1871 till 45, Königsberg remained the easternmost and northernmost major city of successively the German Empire, the Weimar Republic, and Nazi Germany. During the Second World War, in spring 45, Königsberg was taken over by the Soviets and was totally left in ruins. Most German residents died or fled the city. After the war, Moscow deported the remaining Germans and sent hundreds of thousands of Soviet settlers there. Regarding the reconstruction of the city, Moscow first de-Germanized the city, then Sovietized the city, and finally reconstructed the city in Soviet style. Prussian Königsberg became Soviet Kaliningrad. Before I continue, I show you this image, which has some link with the reconstruction of Kaliningrad in Soviet style. Here you see the winning design for the Palace of the Soviets in Moscow, envisioned by Boris Yofan and others in 1932. The competition was launched by Stalin, who preferred a communist monument rise on the site of the Christ the Savior Cathedral, the largest church in Moscow. For this purpose, the cathedral was demolished in 1931. The Palace of the Soviets was to become the largest building in the world, larger than the Empire State Building in New York. With this image, several parallels can be drawn with the Kaliningrad project. First, the design for the Palace of the Soviets set the trend for later Stalinist Soviet architecture in the 50s, the so-called Socialist realist architecture. Based on this architecture, the plans for Kaliningrad were designed. A second parallel can be drawn with the central building in Kaliningrad, the House of the Soviets, which was modeled after the Palace of the Soviets in Moscow and had a similar development throughout history. I'll tell you more about that later. So, what happened with Stalin's plans? The Palace of the Soviets in Moscow was never realized, obviously. Construction had started, but was halted during the Second World War. After the war, the construction site and the fundaments of the palace turned into the Moskva pool, Moscow's open-air swimming pool. Finally, in the late 1990s, the Christ the Savior Cathedral was reconstructed on this site. A new cathedral to an old design, a new architecture rewriting another new Russian history. Back to Kaliningrad. As just mentioned, in 1945, the Prussian city of Königsberg was taken over by the Soviets. The Soviet perspective on this was, however, slightly different. Already in 1943, the Soviet Union declared East Prussia to be original Slavic soil. East Prussia had been the victim of German occupation for over 700 years. In 1945, the Soviet Union liberated the Prussian city of Königsberg. After the Second World War, the architect Dmitry Navalichin was commissioned to design the new city of Kaliningrad. With his plan, a new kind of reality was to be written, a reality that erased Prussian history and replaced it with a new Russian history. The illusion was to be created that Kaliningrad had always belonged to the Russian Empire instead of to Prussia. So the new city of Kaliningrad was to be based on original Russian history. It was to become a reconstruction of Moscow, a scaled-down copy, with Moscow ring roads, Moscow skyscrapers, medieval monuments. As the so-called native city for the Soviet settler, Kaliningrad was to be deeply rooted in Russian history. Navalichin's plan for Kaliningrad was never realized entirely. However, it has been the foundation for all kinds of later plans. This is the center of Navalichin's proposal for Kaliningrad. Here you see the central building, the House of the Soviets. The House of the Soviets was never built. As you see, the House of the Soviets is never built as proposed by Navalichin. When plans for the Palace of the Soviets in Moscow were shelved after Stalin's death, and the fundaments turned into the Moskva pool, Navalichin's design lost its reference point. Anyway, this is how it ended up. As was the case with the image of the Palace of the Soviets in Moscow, all kinds of histories come together in this image. From 1255 to 1945, the site of the House of the Soviets used to be the site of the Königsberg castle. The House of the Soviets was built on the ruins of this castle. Construction started in 1969, but was halted 5 years later. Since then, the building remained empty and became a structure in between construction and deconstruction. Speculations are that construction was halted because the building became too colossal and the foundations of the castle too weak. Other speculations are that construction was ceased because of a chronic shortage of materials, or because of the Kremlin's reservation of funds for the Moscow Summer Olympics. In the early 2000s, there were calls to demolish the House of the Soviets and rebuild the Königsberg castle. Last year, eventually, demolition of the House of the Soviets began. At the moment, however, it's unclear what the future will bring. Given Russia's annexation of the Crimea in 2014 and the invasion of Ukraine recently, question is whether the ideas for a new Königsberg castle are still alive. Turmrückbau zu Kaliningrad, tower dismantling at Kaliningrad. This is an article by historian Bert Hoppe, who wrote the book Auf den Trümmern von Königsberg, which has been a great interest to me when working on the Kaliningrad project. In this article, he doesn't only write about the House of the Soviets being destroyed, but also about it being cherished. Architects and Kaliningrad residents who previously were in favor of preserving the ruins of the Königsberg castle are now opposing the demolition of the House of the Soviets, which has long been considered a monster, especially since it's not clear what's going to replace the building. Back to the center of Navalichin's proposal for Kaliningrad, with again the House of the Soviets. The center was the start of my exploration of Kaliningrad. From here, I walked the lines of Navalichin's plan in search of traces and remains of construction. As such, this unfinished plan by Navalichin, was finally completed in 2012. A highway has been built on these structures in the meantime. This is a bit the same spot next to it, and a bit more. Many of Navalichin's drafts and proposals for Kaliningrad left no traces in the landscape and just remained fictional plans. They fascinatingly show, however, how architectural planning was employed to write a new Russian history. Here you see Navalichin's proposal for Kaliningrad's North Station with a representation of a Kremlin tower. This is Navalnychin's proposal for Kaliningrad's culture and leisure park, with a representation of a Kremlin tower. And this, Navalnychin's proposal for Kaliningrad's drama theater, inspired by the Bolshoi theater of Moscow. Here you see a constructed panorama of Kaliningrad as a reconstruction of Russian history, as shown in my exhibition Border Theories at the former Stedelijk Museumbureau Amsterdam. Soon after the project Border Theories was completed, the Russian annexation of the Crimea took place in 2014. This annexation, as well as the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, put the project in a totally new light. Where Stalin saw reason to annex territories to restore historical rights or to correct historical mistakes, Putin, with the annexation of the Crimea and now with the invasion of Ukraine, uses similar arguments and strategies to justify actions. This brings me to the article, If Russia Gets Crimea, Should Germany Get Kaliningrad?, which was written by the Moscow Times soon after the annexation of the Crimea. In this article is referred to Putin's speech to the nation, in which he said that President Khrushchev's decision to hand Crimea to the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic in 1954 was a clear violation of the constitutional norms that were in place then. Putin depicted the annexation of the Crimea as correcting a historical error. Anyway, Germany hasn't made any claims to its annexed territory so far, but the headline of the article, If Russia Gets Crimea, Should Germany Get Kaliningrad?, is an interesting question around the restoring of historical rights. This brings me to another article, Remaking Mariupol into a Russian City, recently written by CBC News. This article refers to Putin having declared the city of Mariupol liberated after 2 months of siege in 2022. It describes the occupation and destruction of Mariupol, but more than that, the current reconstruction and Russification of the city. It shows how new Russian architecture is constructed on top of the city's ruins, how a Ukrainian city, Mariupol, is transformed into a new Russian city, stripped of Ukrainian culture, identity and history. Striking example is this city's drama theater, where due to a Russian bombardment, sheltering civilians were killed. At the moment, field scaffolding surrounds the theater, showing portraits of great Russian writers and playwrights. Behind the screens, debris is being removed and a new theater is being built. This all brings a lot of questions to me on Mariupol and on other Ukrainian occupied cities. Questions about the construction of a new history in the landscape, the construction of a new history, a new identity, a new culture. How are architecture and urban planning employed as political tools to rewrite, manipulate, or falsify history? How does this relate to the past and to an uncertain near future? That was it.
Surprisingly enough, strangely enough, I found the two presentations complementing each other somehow, because the first presentation was somehow overlooking or ignoring even, or not taking into consideration the political forces, and purely focusing on architectural questions as if they are disconnected, on very local questions as if they are local or only local. And while the second presentation was ignoring also, or maybe just looking at it from the point of view of Russian imperialism, neo-imperialism, while ignoring also the American imperialism somehow. So while, let's say, your presentation was taking the parameters of American life as they are reflected in Western Europe as a given, or as a transparent point of departure. So, but saying that, it was very, very beautiful to see it, to see both of your practice and somehow to think about them together, which is yeah, will always be surprising for me to think about them together. But maybe before we establish something, just the three of us, maybe we address our friends in the audience if they have any questions, remarks, judgments. Yes, please.
Well, the general theme, I would say, for this afternoon is also the dilemmas which you encounter during your work. And so for Michiel, it looks like if everything goes smoothly, but for sure it is blood, sweat and tears. And so I'm curious if you can maybe mention some moments in the design process that you had to make a choice between, yeah, maybe two things you would like to cherish, but you have to choose one. And with you, I am interested that, okay, you did a kind of a research on history, but how was it for you personally to be involved with this history, and that you had moments of doubt, or you know your aim and you are focusing on that aim and everything goes for that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, these are two for both the questions.
Shall I start?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I of course there was a lot of information on this whole presentation, but indeed it doesn't. This is a process of, I think, 6 years, from 2013 till completion. And one of the fun things we did was we worked together with a group of people, the pioneers, let's say, there were 30 people, and they gave a lot of input on the process in the sketch design phase. So before you even made a design, let's say, for the facade, and that's a good thing. So that helped us along the way. But the most difficult part is the thing of taking away a big chunk of the building. I showed you this picture. I think it's about a quarter of the building was actually taken away, and that's not an easy decision to make, because you try to preserve as much as possible in terms of material and structure, and as an architect you're starting to puzzle if everything can be fitted within. But the programmatic question was simply getting bigger along the process, so we had to make this decision. Well, of course we made a solution, but it was not an easy thing to do. You first start thinking about, can we not reduce the amount of parking? And can you have a discussion on this? Why does it need to be so big, let's say? And that's the first thing you start to do. You start to avoid, let's say, breaking down a part of the building. But as soon as you know all these things are related to each other and you can't solve it, then you have to come up with a plan where as soon as you now pass by, you don't even know. So you use the ingredients as an architect, the things you can do in order to make it work. And that's it. I mean, that's a simple thing. There were a lot of explorations taking place before doing it.
What are your most important, let's say, criteria to make your decisions?
Well, first of all, you want to still perceive, in this case, the warehouse as the goal was to go back to the 20s, the time period of this layer. And there were a couple of things that matter, and there's of course a facade composition and the materialization of things, and the fact that you have a certain skill in the building. And then the second thing you want to address is that you want to embed it in the surroundings. So what you want to deal with is that the things you program in this building that needs to add to the environment. So that's another issue. How do you deal with the ground floor, and how do you make the building interact in a way that it hasn't done before? So these things actually are most important to take along in this decision making. And yeah.
The question again.
Alexander,
I put a question that, of course, as I understood your work, especially with the research on history, what happened with the place, and how, let me say, what did evolve. And for sure nowadays, of course, there's a drama that's happening in Eastern Europe. And I was interested, how much were you personally involved with the theme? Yeah, maar toch, sorry. So the question is how much, on what moments maybe you had doubts, shall I continue with the story, or maybe you get emotional because of the stories you read?
Yeah, that later part is more from the later years, let's say, because this is a project from, I worked on it from 2009 till 2013, so it's really 10 years ago. And what I also said, it's, in the meantime, it's put in a totally different light. And that makes it, yeah, in that way it goes on also. But when I started with this project, that was purely from the interest of doing research into the interplay of architecture, urban planning, politics, and geopolitics, and political systems in relation to.
You made contact with local people who gave you information?
Yeah, what I do, and that was in Russia, in those days already quite difficult, is go to the archives, try to get all these archival materials, working together with historians. I work together with this Bert Hoppe, this German historian. So that way I get a lot of information, but I haven't really worked together with the people living there. That was hard to get done.
And your story also remembers me now to Berlin, the Palast of the Republik, which was destroyed from the DDR. I presume you know that project, and then it was now rebuilt, half copy of the
new castle,
the castle and the new castle.
Yeah.
But there is, you didn't make any comparison between these two
Yeah,
projects.
of course I did. Yeah, I also did a residency in Berlin, and then
maybe you can tell something about it, then about the difference of how to deal with the history then.
Yeah, that's the Volkspalast you're talking about, at the Museum Island, and there used to be also a Prussian castle. What was the name again? The Humboldt Castle. Yeah, I think so. I'm not really sure, but that one, no, that was destroyed. I don't know if it was destroyed by bombardments or, but. Actually, in the end, when afterwards the palace, the Volkspalast, was built on these structures, and then afterwards the Volkspalast was demolished again in order to rebuild this castle again. So there's a little bit of the same kind of continuation, or it's a kind of parallel, like rebuilding. There's a new ideology being built on an older ideology, and then build the old history back on top of this. So it's a kind of continuation of building history on one and the same spot. Yeah, that's a good parallel. Yeah. I like. Yeah, I really.
From my experience in the last, I think, 20 years, there has been a growing appeal for, let's say, ruins or history, as we've seen in the 60s. There's all been demolished. The decay of buildings has people didn't like that, but in the last years that has been growing. And why do you think? Is that the same in let's say the eastern part of Europe and Russia, and how is that in the Netherlands? Because here we really cherish that old culture almost of these buildings. How do you see that grows, and why is that?
Well, from our experience, it happens. What you actually stating out is true. We also worked in Russia, in Moscow region, for old silk factory, and they came to the Netherlands to hire an architect for them to say, how does this work? So they recognized there was a sort of characteristics in this complex. The old industrial complex, also 100 years old, the things that nowadays we all like. And they don't know how to treat it, because over there, at least that's in our experience, either it's a monument or it's not. And it's very black and white. It's a monument you preserve. If it's not, you keep it or you demolish it. And what we are doing with this kind of strategy on also not monumental buildings is a more hybrid version. things come together in a way that if it would be a fully listed monument, it would almost not be possible. And that's in our field very interesting. And actually, we're doing this in different countries, and the Russians were actually coming to us to ask on how to do that, because they are in search of it. Let's say. I don't know if you recognize this.
I don't know. Yeah, this house of the Soviets, nobody knows why it's being demolished at the moment. What the ideas are, what it's.
And they do a lot of
It's a good
reconstruction and really crazy stuff, but.
It's hard to answer this question. I can imagine it's hard to answer this question because there's a lack of transparency from the Russian government here in the Netherlands. We have to reason everything, every single action or decision we make, and there is just a decision have been made already. So yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
What was interesting, I think that what is unique in what you showed from an architectural point of view is that you see the different. So there is no smoothening of the recent buildings. It's like you really see one on top of the other. While if I can generalize in your approach, you are more you create a more harmonized layering of past and also in Russia, one needs to say there is no civil, there are no citizens somehow. So there is no, this also from this derives also this idea that we don't know what to do with it. It's either by oligarchs or by people who don't count.
They hardly have a pop culture. I mean, it almost doesn't exist. It needs to start in some kind of way. So it's true. They rely on hierarchy.
I couldn't not recall the beautiful sentence of Walter Benjamin from his last text, Thesis on History, where he says every document of culture is a document of barbarism. Like every artifact, every building, every monument, he sees the life that was had to be invested, and the life that was lost, that were lost in order to build these beautiful monuments. And somehow, with the Russian case, it's not well suppressed. Huh? So you really see the human toll that is given into this kind of false facade of identity. One last question for the world.
I would like to ask how much liberty do the developers or architects have to take into account the social and environmental realities we live in? For example, are there quotas for affordable or social housing, or like is there an upper limit to car parking space, or do you always have to build a certain amount of parking space?
It depends on the strategy you have in terms of mobility in general. So what you normally do is to show what kind of people are going to use the building and what kind of needs they have in mobility, and it doesn't necessarily need that it's a fixed number, but it's something you have to discuss with the city, and then you come to let's say an agreement. If you want to change the way of how people move and they want to make more or less use of shared mobility, let's say, then you can use it as a strategy, and that defines the number of parking spots. It can be more complex than a number.
I think the level of the music says something.
Yeah, I didn't hear the thunder.
Thank you. Thank you very much.